Okay, hello everybody. This is Rachel from MENA S&R, and today we are very lucky to be having a conversation here with Abdulla, who is not only a prominent researcher in science and religion, but he's also a member of the steering committee of our regional network. So Abdulla, I'm very happy to be with you here today, and looking forward to hearing a little bit more about your work, about your research, about how you came to study the interface of science and religion. So welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. I'm happy to be here, and then we'll have a conversation along with you, and also to learn a little bit more about your work and your research as well, so we can have a two-way conversation here.
That's right. I forgot to mention Abdulla's criteria for engaging in this conversation was it was definitely going to be a two-way street, which is something I appreciate very much, because I also always want to hear about the person who's asking the questions. It's not fair to only hear about one side of the conversation, because of course those asking the questions always have a big impact on what the conversation is as well. So thank you for that, and absolutely. But maybe I can throw out the first question to you, and feel free to throw out questions to me as well throughout the whole way through. But Abdulla, first of all, what is it that you study in the interface of science and religion, and how did you get to that research focus?
Well, that's quite an interesting question, because my real focus wasn't really science and religion. It's more into hermeneutics, looking into scriptural hermeneutics and how the Quran engages with other literature in the 7th century. So now then you get to wonder, then what does science have to do with all of that? Well, basically, in my line of work, where I'm working on hermeneutics, some of the things that I also look at is perhaps what we would call authorial intent. What did the author intend? And to understand what the author intends, we need to understand their psyche. We need to understand basically what was going through their mind. And therefore, neuropsychology basically plays a big role in trying to understand what the authors perhaps intended, what was going through their mind, and trying to understand many of these writings, because a lot of the writings, a lot of the religious writings are somewhat mystical. And we do see sometimes like mystical elements that are shared with what some people might call disorders, mental disorders. I don't really like to call them mental disorders. I call them mental blessings, because honestly speaking, for someone to be highly creative, you really need to have, scientifically speaking, that's from a neuropsychological perspective, you really need to have like two very important things going on in your mind. One of them is you do need to have basically what some people in psychology would call low latent inhibition, which means that whenever, well, what is latent inhibition? Just for the viewers to understand a little bit about it. Latent inhibition is basically, you know, like when your mind sees something that it is familiar with, it doesn't have to think a second time about it, because that's it. I mean, once it knows something familiar, it just basically accepts it as it is, and whatever you learned from about it the first time, it will just automatically get in. So how to open a doorknob, for example, your mind doesn't think about it the second time, because you've learned it the first time, that's it just automatically kicks in. So that's what low latent inhibition does. Individuals with low latent inhibition, basically what happens to them is that whenever they do see even a familiar stimulus, it would be to them as if it was the first time, as if it were the first time for them to see it. And so their mind will actually be thinking a second time about it. What do I know about the stimulus? What should I do about the stimulus? And what do I learn something new about the stimulus? And so people with low latent inhibition actually, whenever they look into any stimulus, even if it were familiar, they do think about it the second time and the third time. And basically what happens is that some individuals with certain mental blessings, let me call them, basically some of them they would basically see like different stimuli around them, and when it gets bombarded to them, because they don't have this layer which filters these different stimuli that's coming all around the environment. And so basically, they get bombarded by all of those stimuli, and individuals who are average or below average intelligence, they may not be able to actively filter out things that do not make sense, because all of that stimuli gets bombarded into their minds, and they will basically like make connections that don't make any sense whatsoever. That is why, for example, you would find certain individuals with certain mental blessings, let me say, whenever they see, for example, the color red, they may associate the color red, oh, this is this. And so whenever they see the color red, they may actually feel that, well, it's associated with something, like maybe in the past it was associated perhaps with, for example, with well, I'm mentally myself, I'm a little bit challenged trying to remember. Well, age is coming into me. But in the past, for example, the color red, perhaps, especially in the Western world, was somewhat associated with communism. And so some people would see like, oh, the color red, and then they will think there's like this maybe communist kind of thing going on around them, and they're coming out to get them or something like that. Because even though the color red is just a color red, and it would go and come up randomly around us, but some people who are actually seeing familiar things and have this low latent inhibition, they will basically associate it with something, whatever their mind is thinking about. So basically, people who do have low latent inhibition, but are with very, very high intelligence, they can actively filter out things that do not make any sense to them, but then they will also be able to make connections that other people wouldn't be able to do so. And they will be extremely creative because of that. They will be very, very creative in connecting things that do make sense, that everybody else, they don't think about because of their latent inhibition, because of that curtain in their mind that, you know, it's a familiar, you know, a familiar stimulus. I'm not going to think a second time about it. So this is really what creativity really requires. You really need low latent inhibition on one hand, and on the other hand, a very high intelligence, in order to be able to make this creative connection between, you know, anything that most people would think is actually not connected whatsoever. So in mystical writings, and a lot of mystical writings, we do sometimes see connections that most people don't understand, but the authors believe it makes perfect sense to them. And so that's where neuropsychology, where the world of science and religion would come together. And I'll give you a very simple example. I mean, when we see mystics throughout all the different religions, different traditions, most mystics, they're interested in what they would call, you know, the inner meanings, the hidden meanings. What's the hidden meaning of the, like the scripture that they belong to is actually saying? So they're always interested in those inner meanings, hidden meanings, and that's what mystical writing is all about. But then when you think about it, some individuals with certain, what I would call mental blessings, they would also be interested in, you know, what psychology would call, they'll be looking into hidden messages, even when hidden messages aren't there. So they will, like when they're reading, for example, a newspaper or a book, they will look into what's the hidden message behind it, and they will think that it's actually speaking to them. Same thing with the television. They will think that, oh, there's a hidden message in whatever the television is actually saying. Or even on a billboard, they will think that even on that billboard, there's a hidden message. So we actually do see that there is some kind of a relationship or a correlation between mystics and individuals with certain mental blessings. And neuropsychology actually teaches us a lot about that. And that's basically some of the works that I have done on science and religion. But enough about me, Rachel. What
Wait,
about
but I
you?
have so many follow-up questions. Can I just ask quick follow-up questions and then you can turn the table anytime? But so
Of
first of
course.
all, that rings a lot of bells. It brought up a lot of questions in my mind. One of them, I'm sorry for the background noise, is that it seems like you are it makes a lot of sense why I understood totally your explanation, and it resonates with the project that I'm doing where there were secular Bible experts. I interviewed both secular and religious Bible experts in talking about this science and religion interface. And the secular Bible expert said there is absolutely no reason to be talking about modern science when you're talking about the Bible, because there is no correlation there, but they are interested in other things that were going on at the time that these texts were written. So that raises the question for me. It sounds like when you're talking about these mystical experiences from this neuropsychological perspective, that you're very much using a naturalistic approach, whereas some people would talk about prophecy or divine intervention, and you're referring to it from very much a scientific basis there. Whereas from the exterior, you also do appear to be a religious person. So on the one hand, you're using somewhat of a, perhaps, I don't, some of these words are all loaded, but a materialist sort of naturalistic perspective on religious texts, which some people might find to be controversial. So I was just curious in that whole interface there. And the other things, I mean, again, I'm not going to mention everything, but just a few of the, when you were describing these blessings, the first thing it reminded me of is childhood, obviously, because children often don't have the filters yet because they're still learning all the associations. But it also reminded me of other substances that change consciousness, for example, drugs. And there's been a lot of talk recently of many people in mainstream society trying to induce mystical or other broadening experiences using substances, chemical substances. So I was really curious I know this is maybe a little bit beyond the bounds of research, but how that interfaces with what you're doing. I'm seeing more and more academic study of substances which in the past would just be considered illegal and are now sort of trying to be brought as other important parts of society, so to speak. So those were just three of the questions that came to my mind as you were giving your really, really interesting introduction to your research. And you didn't even explain how you got there, because I know that is not what you set out to study or initially when you did your graduate degree. So maybe just a word of how you got to this topic from where you began. And then I'm totally happy to answer all questions. Absolutely.
Okay, well, sure, of course. Well, let me start with basically the using of like materialistic or naturalism, as we would say, for example, in the way of studying religious texts and religion in general. Of course, cognitive science of religion is a growing field. It has been a growing field for the past decades, and it is very, very important. Basically, a lot of people, like you would say, like, for example, some religious people would say, well, if we're going to try to scientifically understand religious texts, then that would go, beyond perhaps their beliefs and their faiths. But what I would usually tell them, basically, there is nothing really to fear, because in reality, before if anybody believes that there is some kind of a scripture that was revealed by God or inspired by God or anything like that, we should all remember that the first revelation is actually, the environment around us. The whole world, the whole universe itself was the first revelation before any scripture was ever revealed, if anybody believes in any kind of revelation. So in reality, the real scripture is the environment around us. And just as people develop many different methods of hermeneutics in order to interpret revealed scriptures, if they do believe in revealed scriptures, well, guess what? Well, one of the methods to interpret the first revealed scripture, which is the environment around us, is science. Science is one of those methods that basically allow us to interpret the world around us, this whole world, which perhaps is, as I said, maybe if anybody believes in God and in Revelation, is the first revelation ever revealed by God. So basically, there is nothing wrong with using science to interpret the first scripture, the world around us. That's number one. But also number two, something that is also very, very important. A lot of people would say, well, for example, like many religious people would say, you know, God brings down the rain, God does this and God does that, and so God is all powerful. So whenever it rains, it's because God made it rain. But we also know the scientific reasons of why it rains. So it's not just, you know, something that is completely beyond, you know, the physical world, right? We do know the science behind why it rains. And so a lot of people, a lot of religious people, especially even, for example, in the modern times, they would accept the scientific reasons of why it rains, but then they would say, yes, but God permitted those scientific reasons of why it rains. But then perhaps the same thing is with, you know, inspiration, if we would want to call it inspiration. So maybe inspiration is something that is, you know, some people would believe is something that is completely spiritual, that is not physical, that is not materialistic, and so forth. But what would the problem be if there is also a science behind what some people might call inspiration? So, and it could be if God reveals or if God inspires some kind of scripture, for example, or any piece of writing or any, let's say, spiritual, a spiritual, you know, experience, then there could have been a scientific process, just as why there is also a scientific process for it to rain. So I don't really see that there necessarily needs to be a dichotomy between science and religion. A person can be religious, and I'm not saying I'm religious at all, but a person in general can be religious, and at the same time also accept science and the scientific method to understand religious experiences in general. So that's that part of that question. Now, as you were talking about, for example, the modern scientific experiments that are going on, especially with the use of certain types of drugs, in order to induce spiritual experiences or religious experiences. Actually, this was going on many decades ago. In the 1960s, there were many experiments that were going on, scientific experiments in the use of certain drugs, such as LSD, for example, and some others as well, in trying to recognize and understand the religious experiences. And nowadays, the problem, of course, was that many of those substances became illegal subsequent to those times when it actually was used for scientific experiments. It became illegal, and therefore it became a taboo in the scientific community not to use it anymore in any kinds of experiments. But there is a revival nowadays. So there is now a revival in which the usage of these certain types of substances are being used in order to induce certain kinds of experiences, spiritual experiences or religious experiences, and we are learning a lot about them. And we do see that there is actually a correlation between them as well. And individuals who perhaps spontaneously, without the usage of any substances, might have also experienced some kind of a religious experience or a spiritual experience, because there's something that's going on again in the neuropsychology. There's something going on in the mind, whether it was due to the usage of substance or even spontaneously. Something was going on in their minds. Something actually triggered it, triggered in their mind. And we do see, for example, a lot of people, for example, who do have some kind of religious experiences or spiritual experiences. In psychology, there is something that they call the 5 big personality, the 5 big personality traits. And one of them is actually what we would call openness to experience. And we do find that a lot of people who do have a religious experience, whether spontaneously or through the usage of substances, we do see that their openness to experience actually gets increased. So this, because it's actually a spectrum, and so so in that spectrum, they actually increase in their openness to experience, which is quite interesting because we do see lots of correlations as well in that, and therefore there's a lot of work going on in the cognitive science of religion, the usage of neuropsychology in understanding religious experiences and mystical experiences. And when we do sometimes even what we would call psychobiography, when we look, for example, to like the psychological things that were going on by mystical or by mystics in the past, what was going on? What do we know about what was going on in their life? And bringing what we understand in modern neuropsychology. And by the way, my work is neuropsychology. It's modern scientific psychology. I don't really deal with, what I would consider pseudoscientific psychology, such as, Carl Jung, for example, or Freud, Sigmund Freud. I don't consider that kind of psychology as really very scientific at all, or anywhere near science. So, although there's also some people who do deal with that kind of psychology as well, and bringing it back into what I like what we would call psychobiography. But I look into the neuropsychology, what was going on. Like, for example, there's a lot of work, a lot of academic work that had been going on with the biblical Ezekiel, for example, and a lot of the psychological work that had been looking into his works, or of course, we don't know whether it's his or it could be any other author other than him, but the author of Ezekiel seems to actually had what we might call, some kind of mental blessings. And we could see that he's, hearing voices telling him to do something, and he does them, even though some of those things, like one of the times, for example, according to the book of Ezekiel, he was supposed to bring a scroll and eat it, and that's what he did. He ate the scroll because he listened to a voice who asked him to do that. Well, those are basically, I mean, if we do adopt neuropsychology and what we know today about neuropsychology, well, those are symptoms of things that we can definitely call mental blessings. And that's just one simple example of how psychobiography can also try to help us understand authorial intent. What did the author of that book or of that piece of writing, what was going on in their mind, in their thinking? So so that's some of the things that to respond to some of your questions. Now, how did I come to where I am? Well, I don't really know. So I mean, I do sometimes plan things ahead, but sometimes there are many things in life that we don't plan, because some things we cannot plan, some things just happen, and so we cannot really plan. So basically, I started my studies actually in the sciences. I initially became an engineer. So I went through engineering, and while I was doing engineering, actually humanities and social sciences was not something I really was very interested at all. Although, by the way, I was always a curious person, so I was always very curious, to learn about other things, different traditions, different, religious traditions and things like that. So I was always reading about that. But in my studies itself, I was actually very much interested, engineering, the scientific method, all of these different things. And then I went all the way to get a PhD in civil engineering. And then I worked as an engineer as well. So I went into the industry. I worked as a civil engineer. And then basically the 2008 financial crisis happened. And civil engineers weren't basically the thing anymore. We used to be the thing just before the 2008 crisis, because everybody was building like crazy all around the world. But then the financial crisis happened, and then everything came to a halt. And so I said, well, why not go back to school? And this time study the humanities. And this is basically when I went back to school, and I studied religious studies. I studied Arabic and Islamic studies. I did my engineering work actually in Colorado, but then I did my Arabic and Islamic studies in Aberdeen in Scotland. So and basically my mind now has what you might say the scientific method and the methodology that I had learned from my engineering studies. And then, of course, the humanities. And I try to see if there is a way to bridge them. Sometimes, if you do read some of the works that I have done, even the ones that are not really science and religion, things that like on perhaps mainly like hermeneutics, looking into texts and how texts are engaging with one another, and how a certain term in this text is basically looking at another term in another text, and looking at many different terms and seeing the connections between them. A lot of people, actually, a lot of my colleagues tell me, well, some of them who don't even know, who don't know about my background, they would tell me, like, were you ever a scientist in your previous life? And I tell them, actually, funny you say that, because I was an engineer. Because they do tell me sometimes that the way I actually make an argument, even something that has nothing to do with science, the way I do it, it's very much like how we do it in the sciences. Like, for example, in mathematics, of course, math is not a science, it's a philosophy, by the way, but like in mathematics, for example, where you have the given, and then you need to prove that thing, and you go step by step in your proof, because usually that's what I do when I make, or when I try to find connections between texts and how texts are engaging with one another. But again, as I said, enough about me, Rachel.
And
I'd like
the
to know
last thing
more
I'll say,
about
I
you.
think I've heard that you're also involved in conflict resolution, and that's another area you've branched into. So yeah, I'm going to hold back all of my follow-up questions, and we'll get back to more specifics of what you're studying right now, maybe courses you're teaching, and I'm going to listen to any questions you have for me.
All right, so Rachel, tell us a little bit more about what you do. What's your work? How did you get into the science and religion world? And what kind of research do you really do?
Okay, well, sure. Let's see. I also did not set out with science and religion as my endpoint at all. Maybe does anybody? I guess that's a question. My first degrees were in archaeology. Actually, my BA was quite general. It was a liberal arts degree at Columbia College, where there was a major in archaeology. But then when I came here to Israel for my master's degree, I understood that it still was not anywhere nearly as focused as an archaeology degree would be here. But the master's was specifically only in prehistoric archaeology, which is a fascinating field here in Israel. Some people only know Israel for the biblical archaeology, but if you look into the prehistoric record of this area, it is an incredible heritage because of the movement between Africa and Asia and Europe going through the land bridge here. So we have early sites from over 1 million years ago, all the way through different chronologies of Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens, all sorts of fascinating material, which was just a huge draw, again, for anyone who's curious to understand who we are, where we come from, why we are the way we are. Psychology is one window into that. And I would argue that archaeology and prehistoric archaeology is another window into that, in terms of who our ancestors, who our global ancestors were. Those who came before all of us and led to our world today is sort of how I saw it. I did come from a religious upbringing and religious identification myself, but I did not grow up in a religious community that saw any friction with evolution or an evolutionary way of understanding how we got to where we are, sort of, I guess, the way you were saying it, in terms of those different levels of understanding and explanation. Science was always very much lauded in the religious community in which I grew up in the United States. So actually, I've said this before, if I was thinking of studying archaeology in college, I would think biblical archaeology would be more controversial than paleoanthropology or prehistoric archaeology, because I really didn't sense any religious conflicts there. And then I got to do undergraduate field school in China in what was called the Peking Man site, which was also an amazing experience. But I did realize after a little while that it seemed that other people did seem to think that there was an issue between evolution and religion. And after finishing my master's, towards the end of my master's, I did take one course outside of the archaeology department, which was called Evolution and Human Nature, questions for education. And it did push me to want to maybe go to a little bit more of an integrative kind of place with my research. And for my PhD, I wound up writing on religious responses to evolution, and in particular, Jewish responses, and in particular, American modern Orthodox responses to evolution, which is the community in which I grew up. So it was sort of very interesting to be able to do some, if not family, then community heritage, archaeology, historical work, and get to know where I came from, both in the more proximate, immediate sense, in addition to the more global sense. And after completing my PhD, it was actually, I got to write it in the only STS program here in Israel, which is Science, Technology, and Society. It's in the interdisciplinary committee at Bar Ilan University. I was very lucky to have two great advisors there, who had themselves started out as historians of science, but one of them, Noah Ephron, he specifically had written on Judaism and science before he became more focused on STS and other things. And from there, I got to branch out to do things even more contemporary. If I moved from, Neanderthal living sites to the 1900s, then what I got to do for my first postdoc at the University of Haifa was look at what's going on now in evolution education here in Israel, be it in secular schools, religious schools, Jewish schools, Muslim schools. So that was a very sort of exciting pilot project. And what was even more exciting was then I got to team up with other people, and it became funded as a larger project. We got a grant from one of the Templeton Foundations. I was at the University of Haifa working with Hanan Alexander, and we partnered with someone at the Technion, Tali Tal, who is the Dean of the Education in Science and Technology department there. And we've gotten a number of researchers involved. And I think it's one of the really first large-scale studies on evolution here in Israel. So that was exciting to see the research evolve from something smaller and historical to something also contemporary, which touched on educational policy and developing professional development courses. I actually had previously worked with two other graduates of the STS program, and we already had developed one professional development course, which was sort of more suited for a religious population. And now there's a second professional development course, which is supposed to be broader, and a third professional development course, perhaps in development still that focuses more on Islam. So that's been a really exciting part of being involved in science and religion, in the sense that it's both academic, it's historical, it's sociological. When I came to the STS program, when I met my advisor to be for the first time, he said, you might think this is a theological question, this is a social question. And, I got to learn what he meant by that, looking at the different historical periods of when evolution was embraced or seemed threatening to different communities at different times, why, and looking at a trajectory and a history which maybe was not at all intuitive of what I would have thought. Maybe I would have thought at first there was the resistance and then embrace, and that's not at all what I found. I found early in the 20th century, there was more openness to having a religious view that accepted evolution. It was only after the 1950s that we saw more sort of rejectionist pushing back against evolution in the 1960s and 70s. And also even the people who voiced these different views, I think, was a bit surprising. Earlier in the 20th century, it was rabbis that were saying mostly positive things about evolution. When I found people who were having a different approach, I also got to analyze why that might be historically, culturally, socially. But then it was actually religious scientists in the 1960s and 70s that were voicing some antagonism. And that was also an interesting question. Why? What changed in all different areas of American life and discussions about science, about religion. So yeah, I guess it was a bit of a surprise that I ended up there. But as I was saying, in addition to the academic interest, there is also sort of the practical contemporary interest in the public, meaning what are my kids learning about this subject? What should they learn about this subject? Some of these projects did correspond with Corona, so I got to hear my own children having Bible courses online, and I was a little bit surprised how some of the teachers handled questions in Genesis class. I am very lucky that I have 5 kids of different ages. So it was one of the daughters who was in 11th grade at the time, learning the subjects. And I've gotten to be in other children's biology classes and talk to the students and teachers on the subject. And believe it or not, even though we're 100 years after the Scopes trial, which, you know, some people might think, oh, it put that whole issue to rest, there's actually more and more sort of questions about these subjects coming to the fore. And about evolution itself, I mean, there was a Pew study that came out just a couple of years ago here in Israel that asked people the evolution question, which might have been for the first time in sort of a broad study like that. And the figures were very polarized. People who self-defined as secular accepted evolution, and people who self-defined as traditional or religious had, you know, still a lot of hesitations about evolution. And the question is why? And that's part of what this study is trying to get at, try to understand what are these associations between evolution and Darwin with, for some people, racism, for some people, war, social Darwinism, for some people, the Holocaust. You know, different communities have different associations with different scientific theories of where maybe they were misused or other things like that. And then how should education respond? Should it be in a religious, should it be in a scientific education class? Should it be in a religious education class? How to deal with it? How do teachers feel comfortable dealing with issues that are loaded, that they're not sure how parents will respond with the material they're giving their children? So it sort of brought me into this whole question of being interested in how as societies do we talk about things that we don't agree about? And that's how both of us have our common interests in sort of conflict resolution and dialogue, which seems to relate to all of the subjects that we've are interested in. I'm sorry, I feel like I've been talking for a long time. So hopefully that gives a little bit of what I've been doing. I have actually been doing a different project, which we were talking about a little bit before we hit record. I've also had the opportunity to work with a university in Amsterdam, the VU, where they were experimenting with replication studies in the humanities. And for some reason, when they were picking cornerstone studies that they wanted to replicate, they picked a chapter of John Hedley Brooke's 1991 book. John Hedley Brooke is a very famous historian of science and religion, and his book in 1991, Science and Religion, Some Historical Perspectives, I think is the title, was, you know, very monumental. And chapter 3 of that book looked at the connection between religious reform and scientific reform, because there had been this sort of assumption that Protestants would be more open to the new sciences than Catholics or people who hadn't gone through religious reform. And he specifically looked at Copernican thought as a test case to see who accepted Copernican thought, the switch from the geocentric to the heliocentric universe. And if you could say, yes, it was much easier for Protestants than others to accept that switch, then you could sort of verify that that connection between religious reform and scientific reform. And he argued the opposite. He argued that it's very hard to prove that from the historical record, and it's much more complicated than that. And so in this project, they were doing both a direct replication of that study, where they were looking at the same sources that deal with Protestants and Catholics. And through my research, we did what is termed a conceptual replication, and looking at Jewish responses to Copernican thought and how that would bear on the original findings. So we actually just had the concluding workshop on that project, and Professor Brooke came from England, and it was a lot of fun and very interesting. So those are some of the things that I'm doing and how I got here, I think.
Well, that sounds really quite exciting, really. Lots of very interesting and important issues as well, because you see, your work is actually much more important than mine, because you're working on the modern times, contemporary time, things that are really very, very important to the general public. I work with texts that are, you know, go all the way centuries ago.
But these are the texts that are foundational
anymore.
to all of the religions. So if we're talking about religions, we're talking about those texts. So I think I don't think there's anything to compare there.
But I really think, I mean, the work that you're really doing is because it's something that really engages the public today. So it's something that is very important to the society. And as you were saying about how parents would want their children to learn and what they would want them to learn. And these are very, very important issues. And I do understand, of course, in many different parts of the world, sometimes there is this kind of tension that exists, and we hear them all the time on the news on what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and it's everywhere from many different traditions. It's not just one single tradition, but many different traditions. You will find these kinds of tensions. But then again, I mean, I will always ask myself, really, is it really because of the religions and how people actually practice their faith? Or is it really maybe simply just a generational gap? Because in every generation they will feel, well, what this new generation is doing, well, it's just beyond them, and they wouldn't want them to like do these things that the newer generations are doing. But if you remember, when you were a child, you were perhaps also thinking, your parents were saying, well, oh, your generation is like this and not like our generation. I'm sure you're saying the same thing to your kids now. So I don't know whether it's actually something that has really to do with religion and science, or is it perhaps a generational gap? What are your thoughts about that?
I'm going to chime in, but there is a tremendous amount of construction going on in my neighbor's house. So I'm able to disregard it, but if it becomes distracting, if you hear it, Abdullah, let me know. And
I don't
okay,
hear it
you don't
at
hear
all.
it?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So I would say I agree with you. And a lot of it has to do with what they call or what we've been calling sort of identities and identity construction, and a lot of the questions that have to do with religious identity and cultural preservation and values, and the ideas of, I think a lot of religious people also very much want to be open and curious, and all of the scientific values that you discussed so beautifully when you were speaking about your own interests in life. And I think we can all very much identify that with that. But the question is, well, if we see from the historical record that once you get, so open to everything, you also seem to be losing somehow your cultural heritage and your religious identity. How do we balance that? And, that balance question, I think, is one that seems to be a little bit perplexing to the parents that we've spoken with, in terms of how do you have it all, so to speak? Is it possible to have it all? And there's a little bit of a fear factor. I'm saying there are these important values and traditions that we'd like to pass on, and we would love it if these could be passed on along with all of this openness and acceptance, but does that really work? So it's almost like, what do you do with the sociological truth, which seems to come in contradiction to maybe an intellectual truth? We don't want to give up on the intellectual truth, but the sociological truth just seems so powerful here. We don't know how to handle this the situation. And I think some of the parents are really looking for help and guidance from leaders, be they spiritual leaders or professors or other people in the field who they would like some assistance with trying to understand how you pass on these rich, thick identities while also having this openness to this other more global, universalized truths. I don't know if you have run into anything similar in your work, or if it really seems a bit different in that regard.
Well, I don't really work a lot with, what the like with the social issues and things like that. So I'm not a sociologist myself. So yeah, I'm not really aware so much about the dynamics that goes on and things like that. But it's really interesting. And that is why I really think that what you're doing is a lot more important than what I do. It's because you're working with the social issues that are contemporary, that are important, whereas I'm looking at things more of a historian. And yes, maybe I do use science in order to understand the history, but it remains history. It's not something that the general public today perhaps is, extremely important to them in trying to understand, for example, what should go on, especially like one of the things that are very, very important. I mean, besides just evolution, and the whole issue between different religious traditions and their concepts or conceptualization of evolution, whether accepting it or rejecting it or anything like that, or somewhere in between. You've got many different people with many different ways and trying to make sense out of it. But I also think that one of the things that are very, very important is bioethics nowadays, in which science and religion plays a major, major role as well. Because it's a very, very important question about many of the different things about medicine. And I mean, in reality, we don't even, there is no scientific definition for life. And if you don't have a scientific definition of life, you don't really have a scientific definition of death. And so the whole ideas about, medicinal things that are, for example, currently being investigated in ways in order to find things that are good or bad. It becomes a big question. All of these things about bioethics, whether it's, for example, even some things that some people might feel is simple, like, for example, organ transplants. Some people might think it's simple, but in certain religious traditions, that actually is a big thing. I mean, not only organ transplants, but also, blood transfusion in certain religious traditions. That's also a very big question. Of course, about whether assisted death or assisted dying. That's also another thing that is also another important question that comes up in bioethics. The usage of genetic modification as well. I mean, can we, genetically modify I mean, people today already have problems with genetically modified foods, let alone genetically modified, people, right? Genetically modified babies, right? So that itself is also a big, big question. So I really think the kind of work that you're working in society is very, very important, because those are the big questions. And what I'm really curious to know, because you said that you've been working on prehistoric archaeology with Neanderthals and things like that in the past, and of course looking into how education and evolution is actually worked on. So how do you feel? Do you feel like your previous studies with, hominids has played a role in your current work on evolution and school education?
Wow, well, you said so much in that question. I don't even know where to go first exactly, but I agree with you. And I really appreciate that you brought up all these topics, because I think that's what it's of interest to people who are trying to find out about this field of science and religion. The fact that there are also philosophers here, there are historians, there are sociologists, there are anthropologists, there are people who deal with hermeneutics, there are people from every angle really approaching these issues. And I do think it sort of challenges maybe a previous paradigm, which we sometimes credit to Stephen Jay Gould of his NOMA, the non-overlapping magisteria. There's this thing called science and this thing called religion, and never the twain may meet, just keep them separate. And you were pointing to how intertwined they are in our life, and all of the crucial ethical questions, intellectual questions, all these questions that come up for people in their practice and their thoughts and everything like that. And one other thing that I think is interesting is sort of the cultural lens on it. It relates a little bit to the last question you asked me about how prehistoric archaeology maybe could contribute to some of these somewhat educational questions. It was really interesting. I mentioned I got to do my undergraduate field work in China. And in China, the prehistoric record seems to really be embraced as part of the cultural heritage of the country. And I've recently seen a couple of articles writing about that. And I think that was one of the things that surprised me here in Israel, the fact that the prehistoric record, which is so renowned and so important, isn't necessarily as emphasized or embraced. So I do think there's a lot of potential for sort of cultural narratives and understandings to stretch back even further. And that could certainly be integrated into the education system in all sorts of ways. But I don't think that has really been the case yet here. In the US, where I come from, it's a little more complicated because humans already only arrived there, as our current Homo sapiens sapiens, and it's a different record. There's interesting paleontological finds, but sort of a different history in that regard. But I think people are trying to ask about these things. I could say about the education curriculum until now. There's also the question of, should we talk about it at all? Like if it might offend somebody, maybe let's try not to talk about it. And other people who say, no, this is like basic knowledge, and of all the dilemmas you were just bringing up, obviously the one that we all just experienced globally were questions about vaccines and how religion interacted with the pandemic. And obviously in those cases, voices were raised very high and tensions were high and all sorts of cultural rifts emerge along these lines. And in the project that we were trying to accomplish, something with a bit of a diverse research team, people from different cultural and religious identities, thinking about it together, trying to think about how as a society we could maybe approach it differently. The project was called Dialogue Between Science Education and Religious Education. So there's still two PhD students working on it, and there's more being done. We don't have, the definitive results yet, but I do think it was interesting that for the first time we had conversations between the policymakers. We had the people responsible in the Ministry of Education for Bible education speaking with those responsible for biology education. And I do think it was at least beginning a conversation and definitely making some progress beyond just mapping and understanding where students and teachers, how they understand the issues and where they have certain questions and maybe needs for help. So I think we try to, make initial progress on a lot of fronts, although there certainly is room for continued work. And one of the interesting things is doing some of that work in collaboration with people in different countries and looking how things are the same and different in these challenges in different contexts. So that's another aspect of the project that I've enjoyed. So I think we're probably maybe coming close to the end of our time, right? I don't know, Abdulla, if there's anything. I think that we have actually managed to cover quite a lot of ground, but is there anything else that you think that's important to share with young researchers, something that could be of help if they're looking into this multifaceted field of the study of the interface of science and religion, something you think that we haven't touched on yet, or anything else that you think is important to say?
Actually, Rachel, I think what you said is very important, and I think that's really important also for researchers to work on. Is basically, as you said, it's interdisciplinary. The whole world, I mean, looking into it, we don't have to look at it from just a single lens. Where you were saying, it's not just, and you live in your own silo and then you forget about all the other kinds of sciences. And I think one of the problems, I think, is actually education, by the way, because if we look into history, I mean, most of the mathematicians, the scientists, the astronomers, the philosophers, there was just it's a single person who is a philosopher, who is a physician, who is an astronomer, who's a mathematician, who's everything, right? So in the past you had those individuals who were just so brilliant, and they weren't just living in a certain silo. I'm simply going to be an expert in cardiology. That wasn't the things that they were thinking about. That's only a modern problem, and I think it is a problem because we don't live in silos. It is interdisciplinary. If you want to be a cardiologist, well, yes, you do need to understand the medicine and things like that and so forth. But hey, there's a lot more to cardiology than simply the organ of the heart itself, right? There's a lot more because you need to understand, because there's, of course, a relationship between the mind and the physical body, the mental health and the physical body. And the mental health is highly dependent on the environment. Yes, of course, there's some dependence on genetics, but also on the environment as well. The environment plays a major role on mental health. And those factors are basically social factors that you have to take into account, anthropological and so forth. So it is interdisciplinary. Even if you want to be a cardiologist, it is interdisciplinary. So as you said, I think what researchers really need to be thinking about going ahead is not to live in their silos. Nobody becomes, I'm a PhD in XYZ and I know nothing except XYZ. That's a big problem. I think we do need to be return back to what humans used to be in the past, where you would have a physician, an astronomer, a mathematician, a philosopher, all in one, because you need to be interdisciplinary in order to excel in the work that you do. And that's what my message to basically researchers going ahead. What is yours?
Wow, that's interesting, because as you were speaking, not to only look at the bright side, but there's been a lot of also good things about sort of the democratization of knowledge, and each of us not having to think we are, the most brilliant of our generation, and we can still go into academia, we can still do something important, we can still make a contribution. But I definitely agree. I don't think you can get out of the concept of having specialization. We each have to specialize in something. And I think that was actually a challenge for me with my background coming from archaeology, because other people were much more firmly planted in a discipline that was specifically relevant to the research. They said, I'm a sociologist who are studying these issues. I'm an anthropologist, I'm a historian, I'm a philosopher, whatever it is. And coming with that background, in addition to being open to all of the other perspectives on it, it is sometimes helpful to be grounded in a particular discipline. And while I very much enjoyed being exposed to so many different kinds of departments, coming from archaeology, writing in an STS program, now being affiliated with a faculty of education, as well as the philosophy department that's doing the research on replications in the humanities, I can't say I would argue against my own experience of being broad and being interdisciplinary, being diverse. But I would say if there are researchers that are also coming from a specific background, that also has its advantages. And it doesn't argue against, of course, at the conferences and any way we can, it's always great to hear from people bringing different disciplinary perspectives. And that's the advantage of if you could pull together a project which has people coming from these different perspectives, that's wonderful. But it's also, I've seen, helpful to sort of have that grounding as well. So not to have a point counterpoint, but I think I understand sort of both sides of that. But yeah, it's been great speaking with you, Abdulla. I know we could probably go on for a few more hours. I would love to hear more about what you're currently working on, what some of your most interesting finds so far have been, what your goals are for the future, what you're looking to for future research projects. So I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add on those subjects. That would be wonderful. And if not, we might just have to have another conversation, but let me know how you want to end this off.
We could save it for a different conversation, because as you know, again, psychology, right? When people see a video that is over an hour long, for example, they would say, I'm not going to listen to all of that, right? I mean, especially with the pandemic, when we started to do, some videos for students, we know that students are not going to watch an hour-long video. But if we do like 5-6 minute videos, that would actually work well with them. So I think we could stop it here.
Okay, so we didn't manage the 5-6 minute videos, but at least we haven't passed the hour mark yet. So I hereby invite you, Abdulla, to the next conversation. I'd love to hear more about your current research, your future plans. And in the meantime, just want to thank you for sharing this time with me today and allowing it to be recorded so we could share it with the broader network. So, and thanks
thank
for the
you so much,
questions
Rachel. Thank you so much, Rachel,
you.
also to tell us more and to tell all of your viewers who would be watching you and who have watched you in other videos to learn more about you as well. So thank you so much, Rachel, for actually your contribution too.
Thanks. So bye, everybody. Talk to you soon, Abdulla. Have a great day. Take care.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.